Hi, and welcome to Archive Dive. I'm Maria Lockwood with the Superior Telegram. Each month, we dip into files on historic events, people, and places in Superior and Douglas County with local historians. Did you know there's a choose-your-own-adventure auto trail that passes through Douglas County? And all you need to access it is a cell phone. The Northwest Sands Auto Trail offers an interactive map that lets users take the wheel. The virtual tour highlights 57 points of interest along a trail of over 200 miles from Madeline Island to St. Croix Falls. Here to tell us more about it is local historian Brian Finstad, who also happens to be on the nonprofit's board. Hi, Brian.
Hi, Maria.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So a lot of people are going to say, Northwest Auto, what?
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about what this is.
I think it first begins with having an understanding of what the Northwest Sands is.
Okay.
And part of the reason of this project is to help people understand what the Northwest Sands is. So the Northwest Sands is a large area of glacial outwash that extends, just like you'd said, from up near Chequamegon Bay down to the St. Croix. So kind of on this diagonal axis across northern Wisconsin. So when the glaciers melted, they outwashed all of this sand. And it created an ecological landscape that's different and unique than all of the surrounding country. So when you have, in some places, the sands go hundreds of feet deep.
Oh, wow.
And so it's very drought prone. Because it's drought prone, it was frequently swept by wildfire. So prior to European settlement, there were wildfires that very frequently swept the Northwest Sands. Some just naturally starting by, lightning strikes. Some indigenously may have been started for, increasing blueberry production. But the Northwest Sands are basically characterized by open prairie habitat, brush prairie habitat, or very young regenerating forests. And they figure that the fires would come through in a frequency of maybe every 5 to 10 years.
Oh, wow.
So that area was not the huge, giant old growth forest we think of when we think of when Northwest, Wisconsin, the lumbermen and everything. It actually would have very much looked like the Douglas County Wildlife Area. Or Crux Meadows has upland Barrens habitat areas. Barrens habitat is what you often hear referred to as the Northwest Sands, or the Namaquagan Barrens, over towards Bayfield, the Muckwa Barrens. So they're areas where they use prescribed burning to sort of mimic what that historic landscape would have looked like.
Okay. Yeah. And it was also a trail, wasn't it?
Yeah. So the way that this, I'll just backpedal a little bit.
Go ahead.
The way that this came about was there's areas that are still managed as Barrens habitat, like I said, through prescribed burning. And actually those wildlife areas I just mentioned. And they all have friends groups associated with them. So there's the Friends of Crux, the Friends of Namaquagan Barrens, the Friends of the Bird Sanctuary is what we call the Douglas County Wildlife Area Friends Group. Because locally we call it the Bird Sanctuary.
Yeah, in Solon Springs, right.
Yeah, the official name is the Douglas County Wildlife Area. But it's we all call it the Bird Sanctuary. So those different friends groups got together and decided, well, we could make this auto trail going across the Northwest Sands to connect these wildlife areas all together and sort of help people to experience this continuum of the Northwest Sands. What's interesting is because it was high, dry, and open land and on this trajectory from, the St. Croix watershed up to Chequamegon Bay, it was used by indigenous peoples for foot travel long before, there was even any recorded history. So the Brule St. Croix Portage is something a lot of people know about that you can get from the St. Croix to Lake Superior via the Brule St. Croix Portage. And we talk about that a lot in history. And we talk about it a lot in history because white men journaled, and white men who were journaling very often took that waterway. But in reality, you couldn't use it in the winter. You couldn't use it when the water was too high. It wasn't easy when the water was too low. And when you got out to Lake Superior, you could end up being windbound for days. So there was this Native American footpath that went across the Northwest Sands that was sort of a travel route alternative to the Brule St. Croix Portage. So when the conditions weren't right, then they would take the footpath. I actually had done a previous podcast just on the footpath. So what's interesting is when they started talking about, I just recently joined the Friends of the Bird Sanctuary board at that point. And when they were talking about creating this auto trail across the Northwest Sands, and they rolled out the map of it, I realized this was almost the same as the map of the Grand Footpath because it was doing the same thing. It was following the Northwest Sands.
Right.
And so once I realized that, I suggested, well, besides stories, at that point in time, they were really thinking about stories that were geological and ecological because it was really about the ecology of the Northwest Sands and the geology of the Northwest Sands.
They're trying to just raise awareness of how unique that environment is.
Yeah, and it was initiated by friends groups of wildlife areas. So it, was looked at through that perspective. Yeah. And then I just wear many hats, and I suggested, well, why don't we bring in the historical and cultural aspects of the Northwest Sands too, and pointed out how it basically is almost emulating this historic travel route.
Right.
So then the scope of it expanded. Now we've even added in recreational. So it begins down in St. Croix Falls at the overlook where the falls were at St. Croix Falls. Mm-hmm. It's funny, actually, because you had said it starts at Madeline Island and ends down there. We had to pick a direction just for the numbering, like where does it start and where does it end? But it's funny because we're up here in Lake Superior, so that's how we look at it, right?
But that's actually the end in your numbering.
Well, to people to the south of here, that's up here is the end. To us, up here is the beginning.
Right.
But for the numbering purpose, we made that the beginning point down there.
Okay.
But it definitely is a perspective thing, and you can follow it the opposite direction if you want. But yeah, it starts down there, and the points of interest along the way, they can be geological, ecological, historical, cultural, or recreational.
Right.
So
you could be like, here's where a lot of birds grow and live, or here is where Native Americans once had a settlement.
Yeah.
A little bit of everything.
Yeah. And we try to sort of point out in the trail how the geology really affects the ecology, and then the ecology really affects how humans interact with the landscape. And then that affects the history and it all really chains together. And the example is, just the fact of it being sand and the fires made it this high, dry and open land. And that's why people were traveling on it. If it were a mucky swamp, they wouldn't be traveling on it. So everything really starts with the sand. And really very early, right off the bat, the trail actually begins and ends outside of the Northwest Sands, which gives an opportunity to experience the transition. A lot of people would go across that transition and maybe just not even notice. But starting from the south, the transition into the sands is really at Wolf Creek. And when you're at Wolf Creek and you're paying attention, if you weren't paying attention, you're just driving down the road. But there's a very definite notice in how the vegetation changes. All of a sudden you see jack pine and you see scrub oaks and that. And one of the early points of interest down there is Nevers Dam, which was a big logging dam on the St. Croix River. And at the time, it was the world's largest pile-driven dam, where pilings were driven into the riverbed to create this enormous dam in the St. Croix River. Then I found out that, well, the reason it was the world's largest pile-driven dam was because the sands were so deep, they couldn't do any typical footings. So they had to do pile-driven dam because of how deep the sands were there. And of course, the sands were deep there because it's all washing down from the Northwest Sands. So it's just interesting how the sand makes a difference in ways that you don't even fully realize until you stop and think about it. Near Barnes, there was a little settlement called Bingo. And
Bingo, like the dog?
Yeah. There was a Bingo post office and there was a school in Bingo and sort of a small group of homesteaders. And most people don't even know about Bingo. But Bingo was wiped out by a forest fire. And so then you realize, well, it was wiped out by a forest fire because they were homesteading in this extremely drought-prone area where fire was highly prevalent. And then one of the guys that was wiped out by the fire in Bingo, not him personally, I mean his homestead, his land, Frank Moore, ended up becoming sort of like really one of the pioneering guys of building fire towers and everything in northern Wisconsin, really involved with fire prevention efforts and early conservation. And then you realize, well, that goes directly back to he was a homesteader in Bingo and the fire took him out. And so a lot of these stories really interestingly tie back to the Northwest Sands.
100%. And what are some of the points of interest here in Douglas County that are on the trail?
Yeah. So I'm just thinking when you cross the county line, one of the first ones would be the Meads homestead, which is interesting because there's nothing there to see.
Just land. Here you go, homestead.
Yeah. But it's a point where the Meads had a homestead, and the Meads were an early pioneering family. And the reason that we point out this story, and some of these areas we'll just have to supplement with some interpretation where there isn't anything actually to see, but the fact there isn't anything actually to see kind of is the story. So Deer Track Road that the Meads homestead is on, it was lined with people making homesteads, and there were 2 schoolhouses on the road. And, there was all this life and settlement that now you would drive through and it just looks like pine plantations and clear cuts. And you would think there's nothing out there, and you would think there's never been anything out there. And what happened was a lot of these people were lured to the Northwest Sands by kind of false advertising or kind of scheming advertising, where they would say there's this great farmland that you can get really cheap. And then they would arrive here and realize, it was just sand. It wouldn't grow very much. And they would try to make a go of it. And then in the 30s, when, sort of the Dust Bowl era and there were lots of droughts, that's when the forest fires really raged and a lot of people just gave up and left. And then when they gave up and left, they often let their land go tax forfeit. And that's how Douglas County Forestry has the largest forestry holding of land in the state, is a lot of these homestead lands that went tax forfeit are now Douglas County Forest.
I didn't realize that.
Yeah. So the Northwest Sands has an amazing amount of public land, which to us is a treasure. And really that treasure sort of happened sadly because of, many of these people, who didn't make it homesteading. The Meads family actually moved into town and they stayed in the area. And actually, I'm really good friends with a lot of the Meads descendants. And my friend Jason and I, we actually went out there and walked the property and looked at it last fall, and which was interesting because he'd, grown up and lived right there. And he never had actually been to the land where the homestead was.
Okay. And the nice part about this is you can pick and choose what you want to see, right? If you want to, I don't really want to see the Mead homestead, but I would like to see something, downtown Gordon.
Yeah. I should mention Gordon was a stopping place on the original trail. And Antoine Gordon came from Madeline Island. We also have a podcast just about that.
We do.
And created a stopping place along the trail. So there's quite a few sites in downtown Gordon. The cemetery, the Catholic Church, the Umick Historical Park, Antoine Gordon's house, the museum, lots of stuff about Antoine Gordon because it was a stopping place in that historic trail. But also out by the Gordon Dam, there's the Chief Gabamabe Overlook. He was an Ojibwe Indian chief that had a village on the Gordon Flowage near the Gordon Dam. So there's an overlook. It's flooded, but an overlook of where the village site was. And then there's little spurs, kind of side trips that go off the trail in different places where it's close to something interesting. So then there's also a little side trip to the Gordon Dam, and that's a trailhead to the North Country Trail if you wanted to take it. So again, recreational, point of interest would be the North Country Trail. The Gordon Dam, there's, a lot of history there. Gabamabe's village, there's a lot of history there. And then, of course, the wildlife areas themselves that drove it originally, the bird sanctuary is just a wonderful place to experience what the land would have looked like before fire control.
One of the points on the map is something I actually covered was the German Road fire. They've got something on there about that too. And it's just an area where fire happened and talking about it. So.
And that one's interesting because we're going to see it evolving in our lifetime.
Right.
I remember going out there right after the fire and it was just this charred land that felt like walking on a moonscape. And then, a few years later, well, even just right the next year, it's, lush and green. And then every year the vegetation coming up. And when I was a kid was right after the 1977 5 Mile Tower fire. And so throughout my life, I've watched that all evolve and change. And it really is interesting to see how just all those evolutions that have happened in my lifetime now are happening with the German Road fire. So
right. You got to see it then and now you're watching it again.
Yeah.
What was the purpose behind putting this together?
It was really to spotlight and highlight the Northwest Sands and to help people understand how it's unique and how it shapes so many things about this area. So I was just thinking another point of interest in Douglas County is the outlet to Ox Creek from Upper Ox Lake. There, if you look really closely, you can, and I should say the Indigenous footpath later became an early stagecoach route.
Right.
You can see the abutments of the old stagecoach bridge right where Ox Creek crosses there. You really have to know it to be looking for it, but it's there. But also the water coming out of there is so crystal clear. And so Ox Creek and the Eau Claire River are two streams that begin and end within the Northwest Sands. So compared to other rivers or other streams, they don't have, tannins in the water or sediment, suspended sediment in the water. They're just, you look at it, it's the most pure, clean water. And the reason for that is because there's no runoff, because the sands are so absorbent that the rainwater just goes directly through the sands down into the aquifer and basically comes back up via springs.
Okay.
Land that's heavy soils or clay, the water runs off the land, where it's the Northwest Sands, it just goes straight down through it. So even the names, Ox Creek is named Ox Creek because it was the corruption of the original Ojibwe word Pijiki for Ox Creek means buffalo, because when it was an open prairie habitat there, at one point in time, there were actually buffalo that came up into the Northwest Sands.
Really?
Yeah. And they didn't have a word for ox, so they would use that same word for ox.
Okay.
And so it went from the Ojibwe word of Pijiki sort of corrupted into Ox Creek. And the Eau Claire River also is basically, its name derives from the Northwest Sands because it means clear water and in French. And so again, why is the water clear? Because it goes straight down through the sands versus running off the land and then coming back up through springs. So there's this whole purification process of it going through the sands and coming back up through the springs. Yeah. So again, the sands affect things in so many ways that you don't even know until you really stop and have the dots connected, and it just affects so many things.
And literally, that's what this map does, is connect some of those dots.
Yeah.
And you can go from dot to dot.
Literally, yeah.
And check it out.
Yeah.
Is there any spot in particular that's super important to you along the trail that you hope people stop at?
Oh boy, that's a really interesting question. I love the whole thing so much. I have to say, I love the whole thing so much. I've driven it so many times, and I just have so much fun every time I do it.
Okay.
And for me, one of the most interesting things is sort of on this angled trajectory, communities once were very connected that are no longer connected, because when the travel route, the main travel spine of Northwest Wisconsin, went on this axis, Gordon, you find in history too, often there were people that were from St. Croix Falls, and then they moved to Gordon, and then they moved up to Bayfield, and then they moved back to Gordon. So there were family relationships and, business relationships, and travel would go across this angled trajectory. And when the railroads came in, it really reoriented things north and south. The railroads went north and south. The highways came in after the railroads, Wisconsin 35, Wisconsin 53, Wisconsin 27. They're very north-south. And all those communities that were historically connected kind of became disconnected. And so one of the things I've loved about this project is doing the community engagement sessions and even working with other people that I work with on the trail and within the different wildlife areas. I've met and made relationships with people along this trajectory that now when I travel it, I'm like, oh, I'm going to be down by Wolf Creek. I want to go see my friend Russ. I didn't know Russ before this, and those connections and relationships for me has been the really fun part of this.
Neat. So the project is connecting everyone. Yeah. How long has this project been worked on? It's been a long time, right?
Yeah, I think I got involved with it, I think in 2017, and it already had started before then. So I want to say it probably started in 2015.
And initially, it wasn't going to be online, right? It was going to be like a paper map or, something that you could put on a diner, placemat and be like, here, take the trail and just check these sites out.
Yeah. And I think that long percolation has really turned it into something so much greater than it would have been before. I think it was a kind of a somewhat basic idea to begin with. And then, I think eventually you could write a book on this, literally. It's so great. And just the development of the technology aspect of this with the website and everything. Mike Kutnick is our GIS mapping consultant and now one of our board members. Started off as an ad hoc group and none of us had official titles, but now Mike's a board member. I'm a board member. Just never would be what it was without Mike's technological know-how. And then David Peters was a writer for the Star Tribune who had retired, and he wrote the text for the different stopping places. It's professionally written, but it also has a very consistent style throughout it. Those two, I think, have really made the product what it is.
Okay.
Yeah. I was just jumping back in my mind about what I love the most. I love the spaces where it's so remote. If you get out of your car and you just completely stop, you can literally hear your ears ringing because there's nothing around. And for me, those two spots are the Namakagon Barrens. That's a little bit south of us. It literally ends right at the Douglas County line.
Okay.
And then the Barnes Barrens, which is a little east of us, and that's in Bayfield County, but again, just across the line. But those two places are so remote. If you get out and just completely stop, you can literally hear your ears ringing. And I just feel like there's so few spaces and places in northern Wisconsin that you experience that now. So that's probably my favorite.
Definitely. Do you have any way to track how many people are utilizing the map or going to the places?
Boy, that would be a Mike question.
Oh, that's a Mike question.
I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know if we have that capability.
And it's only been up for a little while, right?
Yeah, it rolled out sometime last year, and I couldn't tell you the exact month.
Okay. And it's a free product. Just go to the website, which is .org, and you can click on one of the points and you can read about it, even if you can't travel there right now. Yeah. Or you can, say, hey, let's make a day trip and go here, go see this, go do that.
Yeah. And even sitting at home, I mean, obviously we'd love for you to get out in the landscape, but even sitting at home, if you just began at one end or the other and just like clicked through and read the stories, that's fun in itself. I actually, even though I know this all so well, sometimes I just do it because I still find it fun. So
you've said you've done this trail a number of times and every time it's fun.
Yeah, I couldn't even count it. And sometimes if I'm heading towards the cities or just maybe heading towards Bayfield and I just have time, I'll just drive this route just for the fun of it.
It's something, how long? It's 200 miles, right?
Yeah.
So how long does that take you to drive?
I honestly don't even know.
In the good old Wisconsin, well, it depends on how many places you stop at, I guess. Right? Because it's not linear.
I should say, I took my friend Greg Seitz on the Northwest Sands Auto Trail from where it crosses the Namakagon River down by the Namakagon Barrens up to Gordon, because I was going to give him a little kind of show and tell history tour of Gordon. And we had a lot of area to cover in Gordon. And I just thought, well, it'd be fun to meet him down there, drive the auto trail route to Gordon. And then when we got to Gordon's when I really thought our day was going to begin. It took us 6 hours to get to Gordon.
Okay, but he was with you, Brian. So and I'm sure he was just as interested. So you got to stop at the site and you got to check it out.
Yeah. And actually it was validating for me. I found the Meads Homestead interesting because it's representative of how where you think there's nothing, there actually had been something. But I wasn't exactly sure if that was just me sort of geeking out or if that would be really interesting to other people. And at the end of the day, I asked Greg what his favorite spot was. And what I did when I got to the Meads Homestead was one of the Meads' daughters had written a memoir about her life growing up there. And there's a logging trail that goes onto the property that is actually their old driveway. And I just stayed out at the road and I just gave Greg her memoir and told him to go for a walk down the logging trail. And it was a beautiful morning and it was just a really nice setting and everything. And later he said, I asked him what his favorite spot was. And he said the Meads Homestead. And that was really validating for me that even where there isn't exactly something to see, the story itself is so compelling that the story brings it to life.
What does it feel like for you knowing that this is now live and people can use it?
Yeah, I just hope people find it as fun as I do. And I just really want people to get out there and experience it because it also overlaps so many different things that, if your interest is history, there's something there for you. If your interest is, more recreation, the hiking trails, there's something for you. If you're really interested in geology, there's something for you, ecology. I mean, because it sort of has all of those different topic areas, if you're just a geek in one of those, there's something for you. But it's also interesting how they all interconnect and how they all interplay.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. Thanks, Brian. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
And thank you for listening to Archive Dive. New episodes are available monthly at superiortelegram.com or wherever you listen to podcasts. If you have a topic you'd like us to explore, email it to us at editorial@superiortelegram.com. Before we go, we'd like to let you know that for the third straight year in a row, Archive Dive was recognized for outstanding podcast or audio storytelling by the Wisconsin Newspaper Association Foundation. Thanks to the Wisconsin Newspaper Association Foundation, and thank you. We couldn't do this without you.